Jack Parr used to say with a introduction like that, be a gentleman, say thank you and good night. But I won't. I want to say three things preliminarily, if I may. The first is that Rick Lytle is a force of nature for good. Do you agree? Yes. And if there's anybody who deserves a standing ovation before he begins, it's Rick Lytle. And I've come to know and love my brother in Christ, his extraordinary wife and family. Shane and I are new friends. His great wife, MC, and I were friends by email and then in person. This is an extraordinary couple. I love the golden era of Hollywood. And one of the great films is Shane. I know you're all Texans. Shane was created as a film to introduce the rest of the country to Texas. And I'm very happy to say that my new friend Shane is Texas's best ambassador. It's such an honor to be your friend. And of course, Tim is following. The great Tim and I go way back. I won't bore you with this story, but the first time I ever came to the mountain, I was greeted with an avalanche. Yes, literally. So there go the tales. My favorite nurse is back. It's great to see you, and all of the great team. I want to talk today, and I'm going to be very specific, about the burden of leadership. And the burden of leadership in our public space in America, and this is a big statement, by the way. This is a big statement. The burden of leadership in America today has never been greater. Never. And I want to talk about why that is. And I'm going to talk from firsthand experience, if I may. But before I do that, I want to kind of set the stage, if I may. Because all of us are born into a particular time as Christians living in America, and we're born into this time that we don't even know. You know, my grandparents, God rest their souls, were born in the last century. My grandfather used to remind me that when he was born, Queen Victoria was on the throne, right? I was in New England one year visiting with some friends who told me that their parents had been buying lobsters on the dock and heard a man say that everything was just fine in America until President McKinley was elected, right? My Shakespeare teacher in college was a Washingtonian. His mother had listened to a woman on the radio whose great-grandmother had been in Ford's Theater the night that Lincoln was shot, right? It's a young country. So let me share with you the country that you were born into. You and I'm the last year of the baby boom, 1964. The country that we were born into is the post-World War II country, right? Let me say this very elementally. Before World War II, the leader of the world was the British Empire. And by the end of World War II, everybody recognized that there was only one leader, us. That's it. 2 world wars, the interwar period, the year 1945-46 dawns, and America is the leader of the world. Let me tell you what a burden that was. I'm going to sum it up just in one very quick story. When I was in the White House working there for 8 years, I found myself in the cabinet room. This is the room next to the Oval Office, where the president's cabinet gathers and VIP meetings are held there. And I remembered a story that had happened in the cabinet room, and I think this will perfectly sum up the point that I'm making about the world that we were born into. The only man ever elected 4 times to the presidency, Franklin Roosevelt, right? And the 4th time he's elected in November, and now it's April, and he gets on a train to go to Georgia, and he dies of a massive heart attack. And a man whom he had selected to be his vice president, Harry Truman, right, had met, you ready for this? You're all sitting down, most of you are. The vice president of the United States of America had met with Franklin Roosevelt a grand total of 3 times. This was FDR. He was the president 4 times. Maybe he didn't even know who his vice president was. FDR has died. Our country was in shock. I mean, this was the president who came to the presidency in the Great Depression and left the presidency as the leader of the most powerful country in the history of this world, including the Roman Empire and the British Empire. Does that take your breath away? It should. And the Secretary of War, the first day that Harry Truman is president, says to Truman in the cabinet room, "I need to talk to you right now." And Secretary Stimson is a man of great standing, and Truman, he's gritty. "I'm the president. Do I need to meet with you right? I need to meet with you right now." And he takes Truman aside, just the 2 of them, and he says, "I need to share with you the most important thing you need to know as the President of the United States of America." And Truman turns nearly white. And his ear probably got the size of a cauliflower. And Stimson leans in and says, "We have a nuclear bomb." Truman was the vice president of the United States of America and didn't know that we were a nuclear power. That's a burden, isn't it? Marry that to a couple of years, and guess what? Harry Truman made the decision to drop not 1 but 2, what? Nuclear bombs. Can you imagine? My friends, this was the world that we were born into. And something called the Soviet Union, which emerges as our ally in World War II, but the greatest enemy of our country in the Cold War, falls. It implodes. It had a lot of pushing and prodding, but it imploded. And when the great adversary of the Cold War, who had been our great friend in World War II, when it imploded, Americans of both political parties began to ask this question: why are we the leader of the world? If you were a Republican or a Democrat, a liberal or a conservative, from 1945 until 1995, there was no question whatsoever, none, not even a debate, about whether America should maintain the largest defense posture in the history of the world, quadruple the size of the Roman Empire, and about 10 times as large as the British Empire at its height. That's a big military. Wrap into that the ability to push one button and blow the planet to kingdom come. and you've got the burden of leadership. And people roundly begin to ask, but do we really have the need to have this burden? And one by one, just like dominoes falling, there are a series of presidencies, a series of debates, and it wraps around to the year 2015. You can't make this up. Coming down the escalator at Trump Tower in New York City is a man who's never been elected to anything. And he walks in front of a bank of cameras and he says, I'm going to run for the presidency. Now, I'm going to make another big statement. In the history of the Republican Party, which was born in 1859, Abraham Lincoln was the first elected Republican president. In the history of the Republican Party, with no exceptions, the person who got the nomination and was successfully elected had been either a former vice president, a governor, or a great general. That's it. No other profile in the history of the Republican Party. Not true for the Democrats. But all of a sudden, for the first time, Donald Trump steps into this profile. Now, it's very tempting for me to come to this mountain and to tell you all that it was an escalator, a decision, a combination of social media and people who are disagreeing about a number of things, and the next thing you know, it's November and Donald Trump is elected. By and large, that's the media analysis. It's not true. That's not how countries decide. Constitutional republics deal with the burden of leadership in an extraordinary number of small ways long before an election. There was a lot going on in this country before Donald Trump came down the escalator. And the biggest thing going on was a decision that was rooted in a question, do we still want to be the leader of the post-Cold War period for the rest of the world? And I'm here to tell you with my right hand extended that for the first time in my life, I don't know the answer to that question. If I had come to this stage last year, just a year ago, and offered these remarks, I'm quite certain that it would never have been a question or a debate. Here's why I'm starting in this manner. Because my generation is not going to decide the answer to this question. Guess who gets to decide? You. My challenge to you is singular today, and if you forget everything that I have said, please remember the following. That beginning this day, and I hope you all live to be 1,000 years old, beginning today, I am asking each and every one of you individually, as if we are best friends and have known each other for 25 years, I'm asking you a single question that I hope you will ask yourself and decide. Here's the question. In your lifetime, are you going to be a spectator or a participant? Let me repeat myself. In your lifetime, are you going to be a spectator or a participant? Guess what? Only you can answer this question. Not your mother or father, not your aunt or uncle, not your pastor or your favorite coach or professor. Only one person, you. That's part of the burden of leadership, by the way. Because when you make a decision to stand into a leadership role, however broadly defined, get ready for the thing that none of us like. It begins with a C and it ends with an M, criticism. My friend Shane told us at breakfast this morning that he ran for 8th grade president. He won, and the first thing he learned is his classmates wanted to know why they had these awful desserts, in their elementary school or their middle school. Multiply that by 1,000,000. So I find myself a junior at Indiana University in Bloomington. And I don't mind admitting it, here I am, I was a nerd. A pocket protector with lots of pens. And I knew what I wanted to do with my life since I was a young boy. That it was going to be a combination of people, politics, and the press. I was born in Fort Wayne, Indiana in January of 1964. Yes, I just turned 55. And by the way, my wife greeted me at the door that night to say, "Your AARP card has just arrived." Our oldest son reminded me that I could stop and get coffee at McDonald's for half price. And I got a call from the best friend of the wife of one of the U.S. senators from Indiana, my home state. By the way, get ready, because in your life, all the things that you diagram and plan, I know there's a lot of business people here, you like lines and boxes, right? You like when all of the figures add up, right? Yes, you do. Those of us who are nerds, we don't know what that really means. We're still trying to balance a checkbook. But the business mind likes the calculus to end in a knowable quotient, right? That's a very comforting thought, because in life, if you're a good chess player, we always like to know the next move predicated on the move that I'm currently making. It happened to me, by the way, in 8th grade. I was in study hall, and I told Margie Hyde everything I was going to do for the rest of my life, day by day. And I saw her at my 35th high school reunion. She's still joking about it. In your young lives, make plans at the 50,000 feet level, but give yourself a lot of flexibility and running room. Don't let anybody tell you that this is the trajectory that you're on. Be prepared to make your own path. That's one of the beauties of living in an exceptional country like ours. And so this woman on the telephone said, "How would you like to be an intern in the U.S. Senate this coming summer?" And I said to Betsy, lines and boxes, "Oh, I'm interested in the press. I don't think it's going to be the Senate." And she paused and she said, "Don't be foolish." What wonderful advice that was. I filled out the application, did the interview, was offered the internship, and off to Washington I went. I'm a tennis nut, by the way. Internships by day, tennis by night. What a life. By the way, I'm a god-awful tennis player. And it was a remarkable summer. I met all the other nerds. And I also met the other people who were my age who determined that they did not want to be spectators. That's what we were all trying to figure out in those days. I love tennis, by the way, because I love people. 3 sets, 1 hour, incredibly social. What a great sport. I met everybody. You know, I'm from Fort Wayne, Indiana, flat as a tabletop. I didn't know what the Mississippi Delta was. I met someone whose family were sharecroppers, whose family lived in places with dirt floors and no running water in a house. Wow, were there such people in America, I thought? I met people from Locust Valley on Long Island in New York. They had the Locust Valley lockjaw. Everybody went to Yale and Princeton. Everybody lived in communities that had walls around it. And they drove unusual foreign cars. Bula bula. What a remarkable summer that was. What I did not know about my country. Part of the reason I didn't know about my country is I was a person who had little seeds of pride planted along the way. I mentioned when I was here last year, I went to buy a suit. And the salesman said to me, and I quote, "You are going to be a big shot." And I foolishly believed him. Anybody here struggling with pride? Anybody here struggling with arrogance, with haughtiness, with thinking more highly of ourselves than we ought to think? Anybody here at home receive the annual Christmas letters from your friends? Let's see. Here's the Christmas letter. You ready? Susie is traveling Europe this summer by herself. She speaks 19 languages and she's remarkable. Billy, who's only 4, has memorized all the books of the Bible backwards, right? Lori, she sews all of her own clothes, and her great golden life is to be the editor of Glamour and to live in Paris, right? What a remarkable summer that was. And my senior year, I decided to apply for another internship, this one in the House of Representatives. You know, that summer in the Senate taught me a lot of things. And that senior year, when I went back to Washington, quite unexpectedly, no more lines and boxes, I had a mentor of mine at Indiana University come to me. He had truly been a big shot at NBC News. Retired to the Ernie Pyle School of Journalism, which was my alma mater, a very famous school of journalism. He had been an executive producer at NBC News. And he said, "You know, Tim, if you get that internship in the House of Representatives this summer, I will help you get an internship on the weekends at NBC News." Are you ready for my second terrible confession of the morning? That was a remarkably generous offer. And in the Garfield the Cat think bubble, I thought, do I really need his help? You know, there is a temptation to think that somehow we can do it ourselves, right? We're Americans. There's the peak of the summit. Whose help do we really need? We can do that. Just give us running room and enough time. My friends, whether you're 20 years old or 120, it's unbelievably important to take stock, look back, and to actually realize how many people, most of whom you've probably already forgotten, have invested an enormous part of their lives in your success. In fact, let me say it another way. Prideful and arrogant people, although they may never put it this way, essentially view other people as a stepping stone to their success. Other people are a kind of rung on the ladder of life. They are a means to an end. And I am ashamed, and I'll say it again, I am ashamed to admit that when I was your age, operationally, that is very often how I viewed the people who were working overtime to be most helpful to me. I hope that makes your skin crawl. So I had this remarkable summer interning in the House of Representatives. Interning on the weekends at NBC News for one of the most famous journalists in America. Taking that bus up Nebraska Avenue every Saturday morning to NBC, walking in my suit and tie with a great big NBC badge with the peacock on it. Looking back, I was the peacock. Awful. And I graduated from Indiana University. I was the Richard Gray Scholar. That's a big deal at the Ernie Pyle School. You know, I don't think at the time that I gave two thoughts about thanking the Gray family for what they had done for me. Because after all, I had earned it, hadn't I? And I went on the job market. And within about a month, I became the first executive producer at the NBC affiliate in my hometown. They had never had one. And I wrote the 6 and the 10 news. And after about 6 months, I thought, I think I've outgrown it. And within a year, I was ready to go to a much larger market. See what I had to teach those people. And I received a telephone call. I was sitting in the newsroom, and it was from the press secretary for the member of Congress for whom I had interned that summer. He had just been appointed to the United States Senate. In fact, the senator I had worked for had become Vice President of the United States of America, Dan Quayle, under George H.W. Bush. And Dan Coates, who had been in the House, became the brand new U.S. Senator from Indiana, and he was asking me to be his deputy press secretary at the ripe old age of 23. And off I went to Washington. What a remarkable time in my life that was. Dan Coates was a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, the Senate Intelligence Committee, and by God's remarkable providence, I had a chance to travel all over the world. The Middle East, Asia, Europe, etc., etc. What a remarkable experience that was. He was an appointed senator. He had to run 2 elections in 4 years. That's a fancy way in American politics of saying you're always raising money. I lived on airplanes and out of suitcases, traveling with Dan Coates. We logged a lot of miles. I got engaged. Jenny and I, of course, strategically planned our wedding for after the election cycle. We will celebrate our 28th year of marriage this coming October. You know, I want to pause here for a moment. Another confession. As you will soon see, Jennifer Elizabeth Carson Goeglein, my bride, has made the most extraordinary sacrifices for me. The greatest ones that a husband could ever ask of a wife. How often in those years did I step off the ladder of life and to actually, from the heart, tell her how much I cherished her and loved her and thanked her for all of the remarkable sacrifices. I mean, we were newly married, and I would say, hey, the bag is packed, I'll see you in 5 days. Where are you off to? I don't remember, but I'll let you know. You know, you land in a city in Indiana where you're helping the senator become reelected. You know you've been there too often when the guy at the enterprise desk says, hey, you're back, you know? Logging the miles, raising the money, moving toward victory. Isn't that what life is about? Doesn't that get to go into the annual Christmas letter? So that I can impress everybody else. And by impressing you, then I can help you validate me. That's how it's supposed to work, isn't it? See, I'll have all of these great successes, then you'll be impressed, and then you'll think that I kind of levitate through life. Because after all, isn't that what leadership is about? Isn't it supposed to put us on a plane a step above the next guy or gal? Isn't that what it's about? You know, I have learned the hard way that the world is run by C students. I've learned that while grades are exceedingly important, that with no exceptions, it's always character over intellect. And by the way, if your character is an A+, and forgive me to all the professors who are here, if your character is an A+, the world will open to you in a way that is rather remarkable. I'll get back to that. So here I am, helping Dan Coates and his staff. We won 2 elections in 4 years. Now he had a full term in the Senate. I was promoted to press secretary, communications manager. What a remarkable thing. And at the end of his second term, Dan Coates kept his promise. No more running. I'm done. And I went to see Dan Coates for the last time on nearly the last day, and I was taking a job in a foundation in Washington. He said to me, "You're making a big mistake." He said, "You have worked in politics all these years at this end of Pennsylvania Avenue, meaning the legislative branch on Capitol Hill. Why don't you go join one presidential campaign?" And I took his advice. And I joined a very little-known presidential campaign. Back on the road, flying around, raising money, meeting everybody, having the time of my life. By the way, by this time, my pride quotient was about 6 zillion. In my Christmas letter, I probably would have just had a line or two, something about how I had never lost. Because, you know, after all, life is not about failure. It's about one mountaintop after the other. May I say, as you're going to learn, I came to see that the greatest vistas in the world are not from the mountaintop, despite where we're at, Mr. Rick. I came to learn that the greatest vistas in life are from the valley. The valley gives you a vantage view that is remarkable if you'll only see it, especially after you've hit rock bottom. So there we were in the Senate. That came to a close. I worked in a small presidential campaign. That came to an end. And I got another telephone call. This one from Governor George W. Bush. He said to me, "We're not hiring many people from that campaign, but we've gotten to know you and watch you on the campaign trail. We would like to hire you." Me? Now, we know you have a wife and 2 sons. We know those sons are 2 and 4 years old. We know you live in Washington. You leave them there, move to Austin, because you're going to be busy. I had a long talk with his communications manager. I let her know that we as a family were a package deal. We'd all be moving to Austin, and I accepted the job. The shortest day I ever had was about 16 or 17 hours. We rented our home in Washington to a woman we had never met. We rented a 2-bedroom walk-up in the worst neighborhood in Austin, Texas. The day laborers living below us were from Louisiana. And every night after coming home from the job they hated, it was a combination of beer and pot. I'm trying to think if I said thank you to Jenny even once. My mother-in-law came to visit. She was horrified. I let her know that the people of Texas were very nice. And you may not know this or remember this, of course. It got to election night, and nobody won. We're Americans. We like winners, don't we? That night. We're Americans. We don't like to wait, right? That's why we love sports. I do. Can't wait to watch the Colts this weekend. And I had a woman come to me 3 days after the election. She said, "You're going to Florida." She said, "They're trying to steal the election, and we want you to help coordinate the media because it's Bush versus Gore, and we think you should pack for at least 3 or 4 days." My friends, in the annals of American presidential history, Bush v. Gore lasted for 36 days. I was in 9 cities during those 32 of the 34 days. I remember going to Epcot one afternoon. It was the only afternoon off that we ever got in Florida. Seeing a husband, wife, 2 children having fun with balloons and ice cream cones, and I kept thinking, don't they know that there's no answer to this presidential election? Why are they having such fun? Big night of sleep was 2 or 3 hours. The Supreme Court decided that George W. Bush had won, and I thought, I am now done with American politics. Until I received a call from another Texan you might know, Karl Rove. He was the architect of George W. Bush's presidential victory in the year 2000, and he is a very important political historic figure. He said, "Tim, George W. Bush wants to make you a special assistant to the president and the deputy director of the White House Office of Public Liaison. Pause. Do you accept?" I caught my breath, and I said something like, "Carl, can you please define what you've just said?" He said, "You will be the president's chief outreach person to all of your fellow men and women of faith, to the conservative movement, to the veterans, the think tanks, the public policy groups, the veterans. Do you accept?" You ready for this? I thought, in a flash, I can handle this. Isn't that crummy? That's so crummy. I am being offered a commissioned position at the White House. This is a remarkable moment in my own life and the life of my family and the life of those hundreds of forgotten people, just like the ones, by the way, who are sitting up here behind all of you, who had invested so much of themselves in me, so that with humility and character, I would step up in my generation to help assume the burden of leadership in our nation. I said yes. I was sworn in a few days later. There's my great mother and father, my aunt, who's like a second mother, Jenny, the boys. We're in the East Room. There are the Bushes, there are the Cheneys, there are the portraits of the Washingtons. Off to a wonderful reception, and then I'm taken to my office at the White House. Wow. 25-foot ceilings, mahogany, brass, marble. I had arrived at the Taj Mahal of American politics, hadn't I? What a remarkable moment. And you know, I had done this, me, myself, and I. I had worked hard, and I had worked smart. I had invested my time. What a great moment for me. By the way, that salesman was right, wasn't he? I had become a big shot. And it was a remarkable nearly 8 years. In fact, flying on Air Force One, domestically and internationally with the president, going to the funerals of popes, seeing the Queen of England. I love history and culture. Driving into those gates of the White House every day. There's the portrait of Theodore Roosevelt. There's the portrait of Lincoln. There's the portrait of Coolidge. There's the portrait of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, James Madison and James Monroe. Eating little things off doilies in the Red Room. My friend, the late great journalist Bill Buckley, he once said to me, "It's a remarkable thing, Tim, isn't it, to be in the Oval Office with the president and to have him take notes while you're speaking. To a prideful person, that is catnip. What will I share with the president today?" What I'm describing, of course, is how a weak-tired little balloon, inch by inch, across all the years and all the miles and all the travel and all the fundraising and all the rubbing of elbows with all the VIPs, increases all of the air inside of the balloon. Until God himself chooses to clear his throat. And by the way, we serve such a remarkable, extraordinary, omnipotent, omniscient, mercy and grace loving God. He loves us so much that he will find a way to bring the hot air out of the balloon and move us toward restoration. And he does so in a way that has as its floor the relationship between humility and character. So one day, about 8 years into the White House, I came back to my desk on a beautiful day just like today. By the way, Not 3 weeks before, Jenny and I had been invited to the residence of the White House, hosted by President and Mrs. Bush in their dining room, by Vice President and Mrs. Cheney, with the members of the senior staff of the White House who had served the president the longest. And I'll tell you, if I live to be 5,000 years old, I will never forget the moment where the top soloist in the naval, choral and orchestra came to sing for us America the Beautiful. He sung it a cappella, and I'm quite certain it was the most moving, melting, extraordinary rendition of that great song that had ever been sung at the White House. Did I feel in that moment a remarkable sense of gratitude and humility? Did I realize that I, by God's grace alone, with no other mitigating factors, no merit and no worthiness on my part, none, that I had been with my family given this remarkable professional and personal opportunity of a lifetime? Who was I? So on this beautiful day, I came back to my desk at the White House. 2 or 3 weeks after the dinner I'm telling you, and I had had breakfast with a friend, and I popped open my email. And the question from the reporter was elemental. It's like saying, is the sky up or down? And she said to me by email, did you plagiarize that column in the Fort Wayne newspaper? How many of you know the film It's a Wonderful Life with James Stewart? Do you know this film? As I say, I'm a devotee of the golden era of Hollywood. 30s, 40s, 50s, those films are high art. Frank Capra is one of my favorite directors, and James Stewart, well, he is America. Do you remember when he's at the bar, when the entire world has come crushing down on him? Do you remember that scene? It's one of the greatest scenes ever in Hollywood history. In fact, this is a big statement too, the entire film turns on that moment where he's sitting at the bar and his beard is about 2 or 3 days old. And he looks like he hasn't slept in about 10 weeks. And his eyes are moist. Because in that moment, that very moment, sitting at that bar, he realizes that all the hopes and dreams that he had for his life, that they hadn't been achieved. And now, his great adversary, Mr. Potter, was calling in the chips. He would be ruined by the press. There would be scandal connected to his family business. And by the way, he was living in an old drafty house. His best friend was a millionaire living in Europe, married to the girl of his dreams. By the way, it's a wonderful prayer, isn't it? James Stewart says, God, I'm not a praying man, but if you're up there, I need your help. May I tell you, in light of that beautiful song that was sung just before I began, this is how God works. He intended that song to be sung this morning. Because when I got that email, I was James Stewart at the bar. You know, I fell down next to my desk at the White House. No, let me use a better word. I collapsed. I collapsed. You know why? Because it was true. Not only had I plagiarized that column, I had plagiarized many other columns. You see, prideful, arrogant people never come to a conclusion that all that God has given you and the person that he's made you into and all the gifts that he's given to you and all of the interests and all of the ability and the uniqueness, that's enough. You don't have to sew your own clothes to please him. You don't have to memorize all the books of the Bible backwards. You don't have to work in the fashion houses of Paris. You don't have to leap tall buildings in a single bound. You have to do the most difficult thing there is to do. You have to be a person of character, and you have to be a person of humility. Because when you're a person of character and a person of humility, then everything that you think and everything that you say and everything you do is fully in alignment with the way that Providence wants us and designed us to live. You see, the irony of that scene with Jimmy Stewart was what? That he really did have a wonderful life. That just when he thought it was the end of it, it wasn't the end. One of my favorite lines of poetry, because it's purely Christian. Are you ready for this? In the end is our beginning. In our end is our beginning. Because in the Christian life, God never gets tired of forgiving us. And I pulled myself up off of the floor, and I went and talked to a colleague of mine at the White House who, of course, knew this could not be true. And they began to want to circle the wagons. Now, you know, this is what we do in politics. Both sides of the aisle. We got to protect our man. So, Tim, let's begin building the narrative to counter what the media is saying. And I thought to myself, and I'm serious about this, everybody had their legal pads out. Everybody had their pens. We were going to create the narrative. And for the first time in my life, by God's grace and not my own, I said, enough. I went back to my office and I sent an email to the reporter and I said the following. By the way, prideful people find this Liberation Day. And I sent an email to her and I said, it is true. Pride is a form of deception. And no lie is a part of the truth. And I knew in that moment that my professional and personal life, as I had known it from that moment, was fine. Over. Done. It's like on Good Friday in some churches when they slam the Bible shut and they say what? It is finished. My friends, I was cooked. And I want to be very direct with every single soul who is sitting or standing in this room. Are you ready? It was all my fault. There were no extenuating circumstances. There was nobody to blame except for me, myself, and I. The arrogant, haughty, prideful idiot. The one who thought that his horizons were enormous when in fact they were tiny. And then I did the second most difficult thing I've ever done in my life. With my hands shaking as if I had Parkinson's, I wrote a letter to George W. Bush, and I resigned my commission at the White House. I said when I was here a year ago, I don't know if it's a word, but I slunk out of the White House that Friday afternoon. No more looking the guards in the eyes and saying, "Have a good night." Even though across all those years, I didn't even know the guard's first name. I got into my car. I drove home. And I had, praise God, the worst weekend of my life. You know, if someone had said to me that you have a choice, looking back, this is precisely the way that I would have designed my fall. This is also part of the Christian life. You know, Thomas Aquinas said that reason and discernment are a gift, but then it goes so far and becomes a mystery. Mystery is part of faith. God is in the details of your life, and he is most in the details of your life, not when you think you are on top of a mountain, but when you are in the lowest valley that there has ever been. Jenny turned to me, and she said to me, looking me straight in the eyes, "I thought I knew you." There are married people in this room. These are the words that you never, ever, ever want to hear from your husband or wife. It was a total betrayal. To the single person who had invested most of her life in me. What had I done? In that moment, if someone had said to me that you can hear that from your wife or someone can plunge a dagger into your heart, I would have taken the latter. What a poor, miserable failure I had been. There's a divorce that takes place in politics when you've embarrassed the president. Just like this, you are persona non grata. Tim who? And that is fully what I deserved. I came into the White House on Monday to begin taking the pictures off of my wall and cleaning out my desk. And I received a telephone call. In the movie, every time a bell rings, what happens? An angel gets its wings. But in real life, in my life, in the Christian life, when the telephone rings, sometimes God is speaking through or working through another's life to bless and benefit you. And may I tell you, it's often the last person who you think it's going to be. In my instance, it was the Chief of Staff to the President of the United States. He's Jewish and I'm Christian. I've spent my entire life looking for the perfect Christian, and I found him in a Reformed Jew. Josh Bolton, what a man. He said, "The president wants to see you." Oh dear. My much-deserved woodshed moment. And I had vowed that I would never go into the West Wing again, by the way, because I had besmirched my commission and I had embarrassed the president. By the way, my infamy is all over the internet, forever. In the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in the Wall Street Journal, all of our neighbors learned about it. I made the ticker tape on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC. I guess that was the golden circle. And made an appointment to see the president. Walked over to the Oval Office. And I peered in, and no one was there. It was like a weird Fellini movie. Where's the president? And then I heard a voice, "Tim, is that you?" I'm sure I gulped. You know, I thought that some of my colleagues would be there to help break the flow. It was just the leader of the free world and me. Oh dear. And I walked in, and I knew it was going to be bad when he said, "Would you please close the door?" Right? I was a nerd. I had never been to the principal's office, maybe other than to polish an apple or two. I was in the principal's office now. And the president walked out from behind the Resolute desk. This is a very famous desk of presidents made from the ruins of a British battleship, commissioned by Queen Victoria as a gift to our country. What a desk. And the president walked over toward me. Really? President walks toward me? That's not how the protocol is supposed to go. The sinning plagiarist is what? Supposed to walk toward the president. And he walked over toward me, and he stood in the middle of the Oval Office, and I was standing in the middle of the Oval Office, and we were looking at each other eyeball to eyeball. I'm sure I had bags under my eyes. I hadn't slept in days. And I looked at the president in the eyes, and I can tell you all this morning, as sure as I am standing on this stage, that the prideful, arrogant, haughty, insufferable me had vanished like a London fog. And for the first time, it was really me, really feeling as low as it is possible for a human being to feel. I had pitched myself and my family into the greatest crisis of my life. I learned in that moment that there are two kinds of crises. One kind of crisis in which when you live in Houston and it won't stop raining. It's really not your fault. But the other kind of crisis was my crisis, the one that I had created, and foisted a lot of hurt on a lot of really extraordinary people. And I looked at George W. Bush in the eyes, and I said, "Mr. President, I owe you," and before I could get the words out, he looked at me and he said, "You're forgiven." Wow. I was quite certain I had not heard the president properly. This is not what presidents do, by the way. The fact that he wanted to see me, reached out to me, came over to see me, even in his own office. You know, that office is sacred ground in the American experience. Presidents have committed troops to war in that office. They've made the biggest decisions that it's possible to make. It's not the place where they meet plagiarists and offer forgiveness, even before it's asked for. And being quite uncertain that I had not heard the president properly, I started again. I said, Mr. President, I owe you, and he said, you know, Tim, he said, grace and mercy are real. He said, I have known and experienced grace and mercy in my own life, and I am offering it to you. You're forgiven. I said, Mr. President, you have given to Jenny and me and my family the greatest opportunity and experience of a lifetime. And I said, I let you down. I said, I was wrong. I apologize to you. Please forgive me. And he said in good George W. Bush fashion, Tim, you're forgiven. Grace and mercy are real. I'm offering them to you. He said, now we can talk about all of this if you'd like. Or he said, we can talk about what we've done together the last 8 years. And he said, I'll let you decide. Jesus Christ was speaking through George W. Bush to me. And may I tell you all, that's a statement of total and complete humility. And for the next 15 or 20 minutes, we talked about the last 8 years. We talked about the highest highs and, yes, the lowest lows. We gave each other a bro hug, said a prayer together, and I was 1 foot out of the Oval Office, and he said, oh, and by the way, I want you to bring Jenny and your boys here next week so I can tell them what a wonderful husband and father you've been. I'm speaking just to the men in this room for a minute. To be validated in front of your wife and children after the greatest public sin of your life is almost beyond belief. And sure enough, the next week, we were invited to the Oval Office. Here come the boys, greeting the president, everybody in their Brooks Brothers blazer and rep tie, little oxblood loafers and khaki pants, the uniform, right? In Washington, we sleep in our suits and ties, you know. By the way, it's great to be in Colorado. I can just smell the freedom when I land here. Living and working in Washington, D.C., it's so great to be back in America. He gave us gifts. You know, we just come through the Christmas season. And I've learned the hard way that you will entirely miss Christmas if you miss the giver of the gifts. And in fact, I don't mind saying, because it's absolutely true, that being the giver of the gift is being the bearer of our Lord and Savior. What a gift we have in our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And since this time, the Bushes and the Goegleins have become very good friends. Another statement of humility, I promise. We've been to Dallas. Of course, they're in Washington from time to time. I don't mind saying as least possible. The president doesn't love Washington, D.C. That's good. And no mention of this ever again. And I'll tell you, I would totally miss my duties here today if I didn't share with you the following. And this is maybe the last thing to say before we break. that it's very important in your young life, very important, that you begin to have a long talk with yourself. By the way, having a long conversation with yourself is one of the most difficult things you will ever do, because you have to ask yourself the biggest questions. We are morally honor-bound to ask ourselves the big questions. Are we the man or woman whom Jesus Christ expects us to be? Are we pursuing particular paths in life because other people have said that that's what we're supposed to do? Or are we pursuing these paths because we know that this is what we are made to do? What is life anyway? And what's the meaning and the purpose of it all? What am I uniquely supposed to do? Am I making my decisions based on college degrees and potential future income and all of these things, which are incredibly important questions? But in the Christian life, it's the guardrail questions that are the most important ones. You see, you don't ever want to do what I did, which is to get to a particular age and not to even know yourself. That's devastating. Because when you have a conversation like this, and you give honest answers, and you begin to conform and shape your life into the man or woman whom Jesus Christ intended you to be, this burden that we've been talking about, this burden lifts like so many clouds. Which is not to say you will not have difficulties for the rest of your life. Of course you will. That's part of life. T.S. Eliot famously wrote the following: "It's my favorite line ever written in the English language." By the way, it's only 3 words. Humility is endless. There is sheer power in humility. People who are prideful and arrogant, they think that there is power in that. There's not. It's a projected form of weakness. Humility is endless. And I'm very happy to close, and this is how providence works, with a line from my devotion of this morning. You can't make this up. I promise this was the last line of my devotion from this morning. And I think, Rick, it's a fitting way to close. Not often, but every once in a while, God brings us to a major turning point, a great crossroads in our life. From that point, we either go toward a more and more slow, lazy, and useless Christian life, or we become more and more on fire, giving our utmost for His highest, our best for His glory. What happens, my friends, is you realize that when you live your life intentionally every single day of your life, not for yourself, but for Christ and His kingdom, in service to Him and to other people, you realize that wherever God places you in your vocation, wherever He places you, you will absolutely be doing His utmost for your highest. And in the other way around, which is most important, for His highest glory. That's the whole point. And if I've said nothing else, I will say the following: I pray with integrity and conviction that however else we think about what constitutes great leadership, in my opinion, the kernel of great leadership is character and the font and source of great character is humility, which flows from the heart of Jesus Christ. Thank you all very much.